Hey group leaders, it's Pastor Kyle coming to you once again from my office this time, but we're actually in my little coffee corner that's down here. Today I wanted to talk to you about what it means to inductively study scripture. Now, some of you might have heard that of the inductive Bible study method. Some of you may even utilize this method in your groups, but for those who don't know what inductive Bible study is, it's something that is an incredibly important tool that we can utilize as group leaders, while also it's really the original way of studying scripture, learning what it means to let scripture speak for itself and then taking those principles and applying it to our life. So without going into too much detail in this specific moment, what I usually do to help people understand deductive Bible study is I utilize the SOAP method. Now, SOAP goes like this. Obviously, you have S, O, A, and P. Those are kind of the four components of SOAP. The first thing is starting with scripture. You're always having scripture as your foundation in Bible study. So you need to choose what scripture do you study. Is there a specific one in the Bible that you want to read through in your groups? Say, do you want to read through the book of John together? That's a wonderful opportunity to have some accountability in the midst of Bible reading in your group, while at the same time giving the opportunity to really learn and dig deep in the midst of that. So as you are reading through your portion of scripture, you are reading through it, seeking to find out what questions do I have. And that leads us into our next phase, which is observation. Observation is the next phase where essentially you're reading scripture and all you're doing is trying to see what's going on. You're sitting on the sidelines. Imagine a fisherman, a fly fisherman. For example, a good fly fisherman doesn't immediately tie on a nymph and then throw something in and expect to catch something. Rather, a good fly fisherman will go to the water's edge to see what's going on, to observe what's going on, to see the different bugs and see if the fish are actually feeding in the first place. And essentially in this observation phase of scripture, that's what you're also trying to do. You may have had some preconceived notion, or you may have read this passage 1,000 times and just want to go right into it. But what we're meant to do is to sit on the sidelines, to read through this passage of scripture once, to read through it again, and really to start asking questions. I would offer to challenge you to ask 1 to 2 questions that can't be answered in yes or no when you're in the observation phase. So a good example of this would be John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. So maybe one of those questions is, what does it mean to be a begotten Son of God? What does that mean in its context? It's not immediately apparent from that portion of scripture, but is a good question to ask. So once you've come to this observation phase, once you've written down many of these questions, this is an opportunity that you as group leaders get to do, which is the application phase. Application is the next part of the SOAP method. So you've seen what's going on. To going back to the fishing metaphor, you've been watching the waters as they're playing out, seeing which bugs are above and below the water. Now you're actually going to tie on your nymph. Now you're going to see, or what fly do I need to tie on in order to catch my fish? And in a theological sense, what is the question that you're asking that can be applied? How does this change my life in making it look more like Christ here in this moment? So in that application phase, what does it mean to be the begotten Son of God? In that sense, it really means that Jesus is 100% God as well as 100% man. It's talking about how we believe in Jesus, how he wasn't just a man, but how he was fully God at the same time. And that changes the way that we look at him there in that moment. That's a key factor in the application phase, as well as some other things that you can look at and really think, how is this applying to my life, changing the way that I think, changing the way that I do things here in my life. And that brings us to our last step. What is the practicality of what we're doing? I definitely spelled that wrong, but oh well. It's one of those things. Here's your action step. What are you going to do in order to actually put this into practice in your life? Depending on the passage, there may not always be an action step, but especially in the New Testament passages, like what's written from Paul's point of view and many other things here in Scripture, we can see that there's a practicality aspect, a lived out faith that is exemplified when we are doing the inductive Bible study method. So here you go. Here's your soap that you can have to clean yourself up for Scripture. And that's just an easy application point that I usually think about. And we often use this in the midst of our leader guides. You'll notice that if you read our small group leader guides that we have here at the church, oftentimes this method is not specifically put out, but you'll see you always start with Scripture in those leader guides. You're seeing what's going on. You're asking, how does this apply to me? And then you always have an action step there at the end. These four really create an atmosphere in which you can go in and begin to learn what it means to study Scripture in a really significant way. Also, I just want to let you know that as you're going through, if you want to look more about studying a specific part of Scripture, we have our Banding Together journals, which it basically exemplifies this method and provides a way for groups to follow along with you. The Banding Together journals are completely free here from the church because they cost $5, and we cover the first $5 of any physical resource, so they're completely free to you as group leaders, where you can begin to put this method into practice in the midst of your groups. You can also utilize resources such as the Bible Project, which is a wonderful free resource on YouTube as well as on their website, thebibleproject.org. And through that, you can kind of get an overview of the Scripture that you're reading. So that's a great tool for you to use and completely free to learn more about that portion of Scripture and to get in line with what that portion of Scripture is saying, and making sure that our teaching is lining up with what the rest of Scripture has to say. Those are some great resources. As always, I'm just a call or an email away to help you through the midst of that situation too. But this is a great way that if you're wondering, what do you want to do in the midst of your group? What do you want to study? This can be a really simple, yet a really effective way to dive right into Scripture and help you in the midst of your reading platform. So I highly recommend it. If you are looking into more resources on how to better read and study Scripture, then I'm happy to connect with you. Thanks, and just to let you know, continue reading on the group leader newsletter that you just got and see the group leader thank you picnic that's coming up. It's going to be a potluck style on June 4th, and that'll be happening at 1 p.m. at Knoebels. So I'm really looking forward to connecting with you, and that's